Welcome to the Real Python Podcast. This is episode 114. Are you interested in a career in security using Python? Maybe you would like to stay ahead of potential vulnerabilities in your Python applications. This week on the show, James Pleger talks about Python information security, incident response, and forensics. James has been doing information security for over 15 years, working at some of the biggest companies, government agencies, and startups. He shares numerous Python resources to dive into detecting threats and improving your projects. We discuss ways to learn security topics and how to get involved in the community. And definitely make sure to check out the massive collection of links in the show notes this week. All right, let's get started. The Real Python Podcast is a weekly conversation about using Python in the real world. My name is Christopher Bailey, your host. Each week, we feature interviews with experts in the community and discussions about the topics, articles, and courses found at realpython.com. After the podcast, join us and learn real-world Python skills with a community of experts at realpython.com. Hey, James, welcome to the show.
Hey, nice to be here.
So you reached out to me via email and sent me this amazing email with like all these details about security stuff. You said you were a new listener of the show. And actually, I have a quick question about that. How'd you find the show?
I like podcasts. I love listening to them like in the car, and I just randomly happened upon it.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Well, welcome. I hope you're not having to listen to all 109 of them or whatever it is that's out.
I've got a few in the backlog.
Okay, good. All right. Hopefully you can pick and choose. You work in security, and I guess there's lots of terms for that. A lot of people like to use the word sort of cybersecurity or basically security research. But maybe we could talk about defining a lot of those things to start with, like kind of talk about roles and positions and jobs. And I think it's a kind of an amazing field, and it really has intersected with Python in a big way. And that's kind of what you were mentioning in your email. So maybe we can start there, like maybe talk a little bit about your background, and then we can dive into some different roles and then get into some specifics.
Perfect. Yeah. So security is an interesting thing. I think over the last, 10, 15 years, it's evolved. I mean, it's gotten huge. It went from something where, if you were to look at security 20 years ago, they pretty much categorized it as bugs and break fix type of work. Whereas today, people understand, like what's going on. You can exploit these things and do all sorts of nasty things on computers.
Definitely in the news, right?
Yeah, exactly. The one thing I will say is, first and foremost, like, I apologize if somebody is listening and they've been, harassed by security people. There are some folks that get it, and you'll never see those folks. Just recording this podcast, there's probably hundreds of security people that have touched all the different pieces of software, and things like that. You probably never even thought about that, from the browser, to all the web services, things like that.
Yeah. And all the packages of software in between.
Yeah, it's crazy. And there's folks that get it and folks that don't, and we always get frustrated when people get a bad taste of security in their mouth because, folks get harassed or, there's really dumb stuff going on. I've been doing security work for probably 15, 20 years at this point. I've been around for a while, and it's amazing how many different focus areas there are. And kind of bringing it back to Python, I mean, I started using Python probably like 2007, 2008, somewhere around there, like really consistently.
Okay.
And it's been interesting. Like the security community really leverages it like in so many different ways. It's pretty cool.
Can we talk just briefly, just touch on reasons for that?
It's interesting. I think it was kind of a time and place type of thing.
Okay.
And ironically, the way that Python 2 handled strings, it actually lended itself really well towards, doing stuff. So like one of the big things, if you've ever migrated code from like 2.7 to 2 or 2.7 to 3,
okay,
the whole Unicode versus bytes and strings, that was actually kind of a really nice feature for folks, because on the security space, there's so many times where you're basically doing bit manipulations or things like that. You're looking at a packet or something like that. And it really made it super easy to do that, either looking at files or things like that.
Because the stuff was in a more stricter format as opposed to what's in Python 3?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So like, for example, let's say you had a character, you load the 1 byte, you could basically do bitwise operators really easily just on that string without having to like convert it and cast it as a byte and then recast it as a ASCII character or things like that. And so it was kind of interesting on that.
Okay, you could tell the intent of
Yeah.
Strings a little easier than maybe what you would do now.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and the thing is you can still do that today. It's not like they've removed any of these features, but you just didn't have to like cast them as different character types and things like that.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the things that like a lot of people really liked, because before then we would have to write C programs or do it in Perl and have these like giant scripts that basically did the same thing that we could do in like 2 lines in Python.
Nice.
So that was like one of the things that spurred adoption.
Okay.
But I think a lot of the things is, somebody said Python's like pseudocode that actually runs.
Right. Very readable.
Yeah, exactly. And it works really well when it comes to security type of work.
Cool. One of the things I was thinking about with that is when you look at writing these things, you mentioned before we started that there's processes that are much more based around sort of shallow stuff and then sort of deep stuff. And I wonder about that sort of shallow stuff and those kinds of roles that could be in there where you're kind of needing to act kind of quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Is that another advantage that you could kind of write it quickly and not need to compile it? And try your things out kind of quickly? Is that part of the appeal also?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, and we can probably dive into this as well, just kind of the different areas of security, But when we're doing an incident, like let's say somebody's been compromised or there's some sort of hacking activity that's gone on.
Okay,
being able to quickly massage data, look at things, modify it, and like iterate really quick. Those are super important, during those. Yeah.
Okay. That makes sense. Yeah. You want to be able to make sure you're headed down the right path quickly before you hit, have to hit like compile and all these other kinds of things. The idea that you could kind of just stand up scripts and get going quick is probably crucial as far as timing.
Yep. Yeah. And it's interesting. Like on the security side, there's really kind of 2 main focus areas. So you might have heard these terms before, but you've got kind of a red team and a blue team. And for those of you who aren't familiar, it actually kind of comes from some old military, like wargaming type of stuff where, and this is, probably a little dated now, but, back when the Soviet Union was around, they would have the red team, which represented, the communists. And, if you're from the US, it was the bad guys.
Right. Yeah. So we would be the blue team in the US here.
Yeah. And then we would be the blue team, on that. And like theoretically, the good guys versus, the bad guys. And it kind of spread into the security side of things. Really, there's 2 main focuses. You've got a offensive where people are trying to write exploits, find vulnerabilities, things like that. And you've got a defensive side where, you're basically trying to defend somebody's network. You're trying to understand what's going on and block the attacks. And that's really, if you were to kind of categorize the different types of security work, it kind of fits into one of those 2 buckets. My career has mostly been focused on, more of the defensive side of things.
Okay. The blue side, if you will.
Exactly. And, it's really interesting because there are so many different paths that folks can take. And you touched on it a little bit before, like you can either go deep or you can go wide. And, it's great for different types of personalities because the things are changing all the time. So if you're somebody that, is like myself, where I get bored fairly easily,
Yeah.
There's so many different things that are going on in the security community all the time that you can always find something interesting and something that catches your eye that you can kind of focus on.
That's cool. Just a total aside, there's I don't know if you play video games, so there's a video game Halo.
Yep.
And there was a cartoon series based upon the red versus the blue characters that kind of dives into that, and that's something that made me think of it. But yeah, totally, it's weird to have the last several months to think about the red team in different ways now too.
Yep.
So yeah, maybe we could talk about not only the idea of these sort of narrow and deep roles versus the sort of spread out kind of roles, but maybe we could talk about what are some of the positions, and maybe we can name some of these things, because I feel like, having not worked in it, I wouldn't even know like what you would apply for, or, what would these things kind of look like in and I guess they might vary depending on the industry or background.
Yeah, so there's a couple like really common terms that you'll see. So kind of the mixed side, where it's kind of a combination of red team and blue team type of activity. There's a lot of AppSec engineering folks. So like one of the things that a lot of companies have, if they're running a platform or something like that, they need folks to triage bugs that come in. A lot of folks run bug bounty programs, where they basically pay people to submit security vulnerabilities and things like that, so that they can proactively deal with that.
And that's to outside people to submit them, to find them.
Exactly.
And then the people inside the company that work on these teams are addressing those problems.
Yeah, exactly. So there's two pretty big companies that are in that space. So there's HackerOne and BugCrowd. And basically the idea is you almost want to like crowdsource, the vulnerability finding side of things. So you might pay bounties for people to find security holes in your product.
Okay.
And it can be pretty lucrative, honestly. Like there's folks that's all they do, and they're pulling down really good money, because some of these things, sure, you might work on a browser bug for like 3 or 4 months, just trying to like find it and discover it and then test it and make it into something that works. But some of those, you might get paid $100,000, for some of those bug bounty programs.
That's pretty good for a few months. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So the HackerOne and the BugCrowd, are those organizations that you as the larger organization would contract to?
Yeah, you basically, so let's say, you run a website or something like that. You would create an account there, and then you would basically say, I have a bug bounty program. Here are my terms. These are the things that are in scope. And I'm going to pay people between, let's say, $1,000 for a low bug or $10,000 for a high.
Okay. And
then basically what happens is there's people that they look at all these bounty programs and they find things that are interesting to them. So a lot of times what will happen when you first join, you'll get a lot of influx because more eyeballs are on it.
Yeah.
So it's pretty interesting. It's a lot cheaper than paying 50 people all the time, because you only basically pay for the things that they actually find.
Right. Yeah. So in a way, you're also testing a kind of across the whole front space of your application in that sense, with all these other things that they're not finding, which is great, which is confirming a lot of security on that sense.
Yep.
Okay. You've said that you worked in a variety of different roles and different industries. Maybe you could give us a little background on that.
Yeah. So I've worked in a bunch of different places and a bunch of different roles. So I've been manager, I've been individual contributor, I've done development work, and I've done incident response work. And I've worked at startups, like 20-person startups that are really early. And then I've also even worked like in the government space, defense contracting and stuff like that. There's something for everyone in all these different places.
Do those organizations have really different approaches to security?
It depends. I kind of bucket most organizations into like, are they regulatory bound, or are they like technology and engineering focused? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I guess that having worked in a law firm and then worked in banking, I'm familiar with following, all the regulatory stuff and making sure that people are paying attention to some of that.
Yeah.
I was not exactly in that role, but I have a good friend who that literally was his role inside the bank, was making sure everyone's following regulations and so forth. He's a lawyer.
Yep.
So I can kind of see how that would drive. I mean, there's this whole like vendor management thing that you would go through of like, confirming all these sort of stuff and, getting all those reports from them. And then I think about like a startup, the sort of, building an MVP, minimal viable product or whatever, and trying to stand that stuff up. And then I wonder about, where does security come in there? Like, were you hired once the product was already standing up, or were you hired like partway in?
So most of the security, at startups, I hate to say it, most startups don't have a dedicated security person.
Sure.
People are expensive, and having somebody who is contributing towards the bottom line of the business is hard.
Right.
Most of the startups I've actually worked at were security adjacent or security products themselves. Yeah. So
right. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. Well, it kind of goes back to I think what you started with, sort of apologize. I'm sorry, I'm a security person. I know you hate them.
Yeah.
And that might be that person that they hire into a startup and saying, no, what are you trying to do?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's some awesome folks, like, people don't know this, but like there's tons of security people that literally all they do is they look and develop based on, security vulnerability reports and, things like that. So there's like dedicated, positions that you're doing really impactful security work, but you're still an engineer, and if anything, I would actually say, I apologize again, for being a security person, but, there's some of the best security people I know are some of the worst engineers, and it's kind of
in what way?
There's this thing, that people talk about sometimes, and it's the hacker mindset,
sure,
and it's just getting stuff done, in a quick way. And to be honest, like most security people, that are kind of from, the same time period that I got into it, we're all self-taught. There was no college courses, for security work. There wasn't any. Back then, you had to scream at people if you wanted to get them to fix cross-site scripting, bugs and things like that. They couldn't see the impact.
What was going to happen.
Yeah.
Okay.
And even things like, when we talk about C, like buffer overflows and things like that, where you basically can control the code execution across everything, in that packet, they would look at that and go, well, that's a bug. It's not something that's high priority to fix. And, we'd be like, yeah, but they can do anything they want once they have control of, the execution flow.
Yeah. Like, do you understand that they'll be in control?
Yeah. And I think like education, it hasn't solved the problem, but it's certainly gotten people like, we don't have to have those fights anymore. You know what I mean?
Well, that's good. Yeah. How are you learning then?
It's a lot by doing,
Okay.
I would say my story is kind of unique, and I wouldn't necessarily say that it was a great way of doing it, or, that even some of the opportunities are there today. But I feel like today there's even more opportunities for folks to get involved. I got into security. You mentioned games earlier. I used to play tons of games when I was younger, when I was like 14, 15. And I used to play competitively on a lot of these games. And one of the things that really bothered me was like all the hackers.
So like Counter-Strike, things like that?
Exactly. Stuff like that. and so one of the things that I started doing was like researching this stuff. And a lot of it was things like memory management and being able to inject into other processes and like modify their memory without them knowing.
Wow.
Things like that. And one of the things that, and I know this probably sounds terrible, and hopefully like nobody recognizes me that I did this to them, but I
all right. What was your handle back then? Just kidding.
But I would actually write cheats before summer, get them distributed out. And then I would send in kind of these anonymous tips, to the punk busters. And there were some others, back in the day, like, this is how you detect it. And I'd get tons of people banned right before summer, so that when I was off, I could actually play games without a bunch of hackers.
There you go. Nice.
Yeah. But, so that's kind of what I got into security on. From there, I worked at some tech companies, that were in this like massive growth stage. I just learned more and more and more, and that kind of led me down the path.
Was there like a community that you could reach out to ask questions, or I'm going to make an assumption that's probably not good, that a lot of security people would be like kind of private and introverted in a way that they may not want to share, or they may not want to share what they found out,
It's really weird. The security community is probably one of the most like tight-knit communities that I've ever seen.
Okay.
And it's really hard to like kind of get in there.
Yeah, that's what I would think that maybe.
Yeah,
okay.
like once you're
there's got to be trust.
Yeah, exactly. Like,
okay.
There's all sorts of like private conferences that you have to get invited to attend, and
okay.
Things like that. But like once you get in there and you start meeting folks, and this is unfortunately with like COVID and stuff like that, it's kind of dampened that a little bit. But meeting people in person and being able to shake hands with somebody's, that's one of the biggest things in the security side of things, where it's like, I can see you, I understand you, and what I mean? Like you're a real person, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it's interesting. So like, if anyone's listening and they want to start getting into security, one of the things that I would recommend is, figure out what interests you. If you want to write code or you want to do vulnerability research, there's all these different projects that you can get involved in. And with stuff being open source, there's a bunch of like awesome lists. I'm sure everyone's probably heard of these, but on the security side of things, like there's so many different products and technologies out there that, and I don't mean to throw shade at, the community, but like, we're not engineers. Like we're doing this stuff because we have to, not because it's like what we're really good at. Like a lot of us don't have CS degrees and,
right.
Things like that.
I wonder if that helps in some ways, that you look at problems in a different way that a computer scientist wouldn't.
It can. I will say like some of the, and this is probably like why when security was like really starting to get focus, I would say like in the early 2000s, it was so hard because before they were like, well, that's just a memory safety bug. You know what I mean? And we're like, yeah, but we can control the code execution and we can do whatever we want remotely,
Would you have to show them that? Would you have to go that extra step of like, okay, we'll stand it up and let me show it?
A lot of times, yeah.
Okay. Interesting. And then their eyes would open.
And even then, though, sometimes they'd be like, well, this runs as nobody can, execute that application or something like that, or you need these permissions. And it's like, well, yeah, but if I chain these three things together, then all of a sudden I've got the keys to the kingdom. You know what I mean?
Okay. Yeah. It's kind of hard to probably extrapolate your vision to, like, you're having to cross the boundary between the software developer and the computer science kind of background people, and working really intensely creating these tools and so forth. And you're on the outside trying to point out vulnerabilities and so forth. And number one, nobody really likes to have their stuff poked at.
Mm-hmm.
But also just having to be able to communicate with them, you have to kind of like learn the some of the terminology. I'm guessing a lot of times as a researcher, you may not be privy to the source code.
So let's go back to the red team, blue team side of things.
Sure.
So
okay.
In both the red team and the blue team, there's kind of these sub-specializations. And on the red team side of things, there's a couple different specializations. So one is what we call pen testing. I'm sure folks have probably had pen testers comb through their code and things like that. And there's different types of pen tests. So there's black box pen tests where you have no access to any of the source code or anything like that.
Okay.
And then, there's other times where you're basically going through and doing code reviews. And a lot of times they do different focus on things. And also, I'll say there's a lot, the ecosystem's changed. Like there's just like with linting and, things like that. There's so many tools nowadays that can help with like code quality. Because at the end of the day, like security issues, vulnerability is just a software bug that, is basically the software isn't correct and can be leveraged in some way. Then you get into like the exploitation side of things where you're actually using a vulnerability to do something bad.
Okay.
Most of the time when we talk about like security vulnerabilities, I mean, it's just bugs on that allow some sort of like behavior that wasn't expected to occur.
Yeah, I think about there's, I don't know, probably in the last 2 years of me doing this, I've talked about a handful of these. I would characterize them as automated sort of tools that can scan through your code. Sneak is one that I think of that I heard about pretty early on when people were talking about distributing cloud code, Docker containers and things like that, and stuff that you're going to put out there. That's one I can think of. I think Sentry is another one. And a lot of other services, this is like one of the additional components to it, that it can kind of look for, if you will, known vulnerabilities in some ways. Obviously, people need to make those tools, so that's part of a job. And that sounded like what you had said you were working in somewhat in a startup world, right? Okay. And then outside of that, I would guess there'd be just new stuff all the time. Is that the case too?
Yeah, it's interesting because like the attack landscape changes. And, the other thing is like as new features get introduced, like sometimes entire classes of attacks just go away.
You have an example of that?
Yeah. So, and this might not necessarily be Python specific, but you think about memory corruption bugs.
Okay.
Really kind of the reason why Go and Rust kind of became a thing. Entire classes of attacks like memory corruption, vulnerabilities, and things like that, either they've been completely neutered where you can't even do it if you're using things correctly in the language, or they become extremely difficult to actually pull off in those languages.
So you're saying the shift to these newer languages. I don't know the age of Go. I know Rust is newer. Is moving beyond the programming directly in something like C, which maybe has a broader surface of attack?
Yeah. On that stuff, they're getting rid of a lot of the attack surface, errors where people could introduce it. But even on the Python side of things, like the type hinting and some of the tools that you have where you can actually enforce those type hints, there are certain areas where you can actually like neutralize out certain types of attacks by doing that. And so like, pulling it back to Python, even Python evolves and starts, introducing things that can help the security problem.
That's I have my co-host Christopher, who he's not a fan of type hints. We kind of go back and forth about it in kind of a joking way. And I'm not religious one way or the other, but I do see the advantages of them and can kind of see, I don't know, if you will, the writing on the wall. Like this is a direction you're headed, especially if your software has to talk with other software. Or do things like a lot of the stuff you're talking about is very much web-based. And what is not connected in this sense? I mean, yes, there are tools that work entirely just on your own machine, but your machine is still connected to the web too. So I don't know. It's kind of interesting times. And so I can see the advantages, and it's cool to hear that, that's helping in a lot of ways, that type hints can help to reduce the
security attack surface, right?
Yeah, I think that's cool. It's good to know, it's not like another little thing just to, hey, pay attention, this is sort of happening. Yeah.
Security is interesting. It's one of these things where like a little bit goes a long way. It's hard because you always have this, and this is kind of the difference between people who get it and people who don't. You run up against velocity versus security. And sometimes velocity wins.
What's that mean?
So like, think about how quick it takes to develop software.
Yeah.
If you're having to think about things and do type hints for, every single thing,
right,
it might slow things down. Like if you're only using this function internally, maybe, the type hint isn't going to give you that much advantage. But if you're writing like a REST API or something like that,
right,
knowing that this is this type of data, and being able to tell your your code checker, all the tools we discussed before, that it's expecting this type, and then something gets passed to it that isn't that type. All of a sudden you can help those out tremendously.
Yeah.
And it goes back to like that regulated versus unregulated. If security is a really big concern to someone, then they should do those things. They should have code coverage in their pipelines and things like that.
Yeah, that's been another theme, obviously, that we've been talking about is testing.
Yep.
I wonder about that, like as part of the tools that you've created as they mature. Is that something you're adding as you go, adding tests to the kind of Python tools that you work with?
So, it's a lot easier to add it in the beginning. Let's put it that way.
Okay. So sort of maybe test-driven development style.
I don't do much test-driven development myself.
Okay.
Normally, what I do on my personal projects, or things like that, is I try to set up reasonable, tests and things like that. The thing though is like as you're writing the code and like doing these things, it's a lot easier to do it as you're writing it and doing it all together than going, oh, I'll retrofit it some other time. I'll get to it.
Right. When are you going to find the time when you're
exactly
maybe putting out other fires? Exactly.
So
okay.
I'll also say in some ways, security people can sometimes be hypocrites because,
Sure. I think all developers can be in a
yeah.
do as I do.
Exactly.
Do as I say, don't as I
right.
do. Yeah, or whatever.
Yeah. But we're humans. That's a problem.
Yeah.
If computers wrote code, it would probably be fairly correct.
So. I don't know. They're trying it. These
some of
GitHub
that stuff is
tools and stuff.
Yeah, some of that stuff is.
I wonder if that, I wonder about that possibly propagating security issues.
Yeah, I mean,
the idea that they've looked at all of these existing repositories and then are kind of giving you suggestions. But I guess that's maybe one of the reasons you would have automated testing at the end of what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing is a lot of those tools, they've put a lot of thought into that. And I would almost argue, in some ways, some of that code that gets produced, if it's done right, it can actually be quite a bit more secure than other things. I think, I don't think we're there today.
Okay.
And it's that little asterisk, like if done right, you know what I mean?
Right.
But, we'll see in 5-10 years, like how all that stuff shakes out.
Yeah. One of the things that you had suggested in your email that we could maybe get into, a couple of these things, definitely they could be like you said, like an entire episode, but maybe let's talk about these two sort of areas of incident response and forensics. I think that it kind of relates to some of the stuff we've already been talking about a little bit, but what is incident response or IR?
Yeah, so incident response, if you imagine some sort of security incident taking place, let's say a really common thing is, hey, my account got taken over. My email, the password got reset.
Okay.
Somebody stole that. And then, basically, let's imagine this in the context of, a company or a corporation.
Sure.
That's pretty important.
Like a phishing attempt happened.
Yeah, exactly. Or even worse, I've seen where, all of a sudden internal people from a legitimate email inside a company starts trying to like phish people or say, hey, I need you to transfer, $400,000, to this account right now. Don't call me to verify it. You know what I mean? But I just really need you to wire transfer this, And so like that'll kick off something that we typically would call an incident. And really an incident kind of goes through a couple different phases. So like first phase, you're going to triage it and figure out what's going on. Is this an actual legitimate security thing that's going on? Do we need to engage and do we need to bring in consultants and do forensic work, or can we do this in house? What do we got to do to basically almost just stop the bleeding? Really?
Is there a flow chart of questions to go through, or is it just something that you get comfortable in knowing?
It really depends. There are, people call these like playbooks. The thing is, it's so dynamic, and having somebody with experience that understands it can be the difference between responding in an hour or having something that takes weeks to deal with.
Okay.
A lot of times it just depends on what it is. Like I've been at places where we've gotten notification from law enforcement agencies and they're like, hey, we noticed you're communicating with this bad host. Like, we really need you to look at this. You know what I mean?
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. And
as an example, how did it get to them? Was it reported to them, or they are looking at they're monitoring services?
that stuff.
Okay.
Yeah. So you can almost think of it like, sometimes they might be doing a wiretap on something. Like a really common example of this would be, let's say you work, at a big company and they're watching a criminal doing some of the work. Sometimes they will actually proactively engage victims to basically let them know that they've been compromised.
Okay.
And it's something like they don't do all the time because sometimes these are active cases and they can't, tip the bad guys off or whatever.
Right.
But sometimes they've got trusted contacts at, some of these companies, or let's say they're in the government, they might do like an intergovernment, notification or something like that.
Okay.
There's all sorts of stuff on that.
This week, I want to shine a spotlight on another Real Python video course. It's titled Exploring HTTPS and Cryptography in Python. The course is based on a Real Python article by Logan Jones, and the instructor for the course is my frequent co-host, Christopher Trudeau. He takes you through the various factors that combine to keep communications over the internet safe. You'll see concrete examples of how a Python HTTPS application keeps information secure. In the course, you'll learn how to monitor and analyze network traffic, apply cryptography to keep data safe, describe the core concepts of public key infrastructure, PKI, create your own certificate authority, build a Python HTTPS application, and identify common Python HTTPS warnings and errors. I think learning the fundamentals of HTTPS and cryptography in Python is a crucial skill for anyone interested in building applications for the web. And like most of the video courses on Real Python, the course is broken into easily consumable sections and has code samples for the techniques shown. All of our courses include a transcript and closed captions. Check out the video course. You can find a link in the show notes, or you can find it using the enhanced search tool on realpython.com. It sounds like that can be a lot of different things that the person who's the researcher, if you will, the responder, would need to do. Where does maybe Python come in there? Like where are they using and how are they looking at the situation?
Yeah, so the really nice thing about Python is it is really easy for certain deployments to push out.
Okay.
Like one of the things, especially on the OS X side, and I have a little bit of mixed feelings on it. Like on one hand, I'm kind of happy that they're removing the Mac OS or whatever.
Yeah, it keeps changing its name.
Whatever the current iteration they're calling it. They're removing, I think in the next version, the built-in Python, and then
I won't have one. Yeah. I think my newest computer did not come with it at all.
And so I'm a little torn on that because, one of the nice things with incident response is you could, on most Linux hosts, you're going to have a Python interpreter there. And yes, it might be the system one. It might not be up to date. It might not be, the most recent version, but you always know it'll be there. You know what I mean?
Okay.
And so if you write code based on that, a lot of times you can do like artifact collection. So for example, on OS X hosts, let's say somebody has their laptop hacked. You can write scripts that would basically pull all of those artifacts, immediately in.
Describe artifacts for me.
So when I talk about artifacts, like forensic artifacts, these are any types of data. So it can be files, it can be email bundles.
Okay.
Really good example is log files.
Yeah. Okay. Sure.
You'll want to pull those back, look at them, analyze them, stuff like that.
What processes were running at the time?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Things like DNS caches are really good things. So I can look at the local resolver cache and figure out what hosts have been resolved to what IPs.
Okay.
And sometimes that can help with investigations and things like that.
Okay. Nice. I think that answers some of the questions on like somebody going in and, like you said, running these tools directly.
Mm-hmm.
Let's, you didn't mention Windows or newer Macs that maybe don't have Python. How would you get your scripts running then? Would you maybe use other tools, or would you say, I'm going to install Python for the moment on this thing, and like I need to have I don't know if you need administrative access any way you look at it.
There's some new packaging tools, but and shoot, of course, now that I'm talking about it, it won't show up. But
well, you can send me links.
Yeah, we'll send links in the show notes. But
okay,
there's actually some tools that you can basically package an entire interpreter along with a script.
Okay,
and then it has a self-contained binary. So, like on Windows, it would just have an exe file.
Yeah,
and then OS 10 it would just be a Mako.
Yeah, there's like
binary.
A Pi installer is one.
Exactly. That's the one I've used before.
Okay,
and it's worked really awesome. For some of those things.
Okay. And it can get to the low level stuff. It can run.
Yeah.
It can find the logs and
exactly. I mean,
and crawl across the directories and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And so I've used those before with really good success.
Okay.
It's really nice to be able to say like, hey, just run this thing, and it basically grabs everything that you would want and ships it off. The other thing, there's some really cool tools. Volatility is one of the tools, and it's an entire memory analysis framework written in Python.
Okay,
it's awesome. So like one of the things you can do is basically do a snapshot of let's say you're on a Windows box and it's got malware running. You can take a snapshot of that entire memory of that host, and then use volatility to slice and dice it.
You look for patterns then with that?
You can pull data out of it. So let's say, for example, you've got a malware and it's using an encrypted connection to a command and control server where it's, sending commands and telling it to do certain things.
Okay.
You could use volatility to basically take a snapshot of that, the private key of that encryption key. And then what you can do, and I've done this a lot, is you use that to then write a parser. So you can go back and forensically analyze, like, let's say you have a full packet capture where you're basically doing a wiretap on the network.
Do you use a tool like Wireshark for something like that? Or are there better tools than that?
For most larger companies, they're going to be using something different. Wireshark's great for like an individual host, but when you're talking about like 10, 40 gig networks, it's not really feasible.
It's a bigger tool.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But the thing is like I've written tons of parsers where, like I'll extract out using Python, these private keys, and, then I write a decoder in Python, and basically I can pull the packet capture. There's all sorts of really awesome libraries. And the really nice thing with Python, which I think is why a lot of people in the security community use it, if there are C tools, building Python bindings is super simple. And most of the common stuff already has Python bindings. And so you can use these like lower level tools, like libpcap or things like that. And they're really powerful, well maintained, but then bring it up into a higher level language, like Python. And it becomes really simple to do a lot of work.
Yeah, that sounds cool.
Yeah, it really is.
That felt like it kind of crossed over. Like, is that still kind of an incident response thing versus a forensic thing?
It can be. I mean, so the thing is, we do a lot of retroactive like assessments. Like, what did we get right? What did we get wrong?
The what is that called?
Postmortems. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And one of the things is, and this is kind of one of the areas that I focus on, is we do a lot of monitoring after the fact, like trying to figure out what a attacker is doing.
Sorry, I immediately had this idea of like a criminal coming back to the scene of the crime, and I'm guessing that might be the case.
It's exactly, that sort of thing. Yeah. So like, one of the things is we might kick them out of a network, but we want to see what they're doing, like in general. So, like one of the big things that a lot of folks in the security side of the house do is they use Python for monitoring things,
Okay.
For example, like
set up monitors and dashboards to see if you're being probed.
Yeah, exactly. Or another good example is, so there's two other things. If folks have heard of honeypots,
Yeah, I wanted to go into that.
yeah. So like the idea is I'm gonna pretend that I'm super vulnerable and I have like vulnerable software. There's some honeypots that have been written in Python that are really cool.
Okay.
And, basically I'm just gonna pretend that I'm vulnerable. I'm not really vulnerable because I'm not running that software. But when you try to exploit me, what I'm gonna do is take that exploit code, I'm gonna save it, and then, basically pull down what you're doing.
And then people are lazy. They probably reuse a lot of stuff,
Oh
right?
yeah, all the time.
Okay.
It's great. It's great for me,
Yeah. Okay.
And I joke when people do these like big blog posts, they're basically doing the QA work for the malware authors, like by letting them know what they made a mistake on,
Okay.
But it's really cool. Like, on the honeypot side of things, there's some really powerful ones that have been written in Python. I'm sure we can share some show notes on that too.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, I think it might be neat just to see what somebody might want to look at the code, just to see how something like that is structured.
Yeah, and it's super cool. There's some that are like network based. There's some that are web based. Like the network based ones will basically emulate a service, so it might pretend that it's like SMTP or something like that, and then try to pull all the data on there. Whereas like some of the more HTTP based ones, it might be like, hey, I'm running WordPress, it's got a giant sign that says hack me.
I've had so many nightmares. I have some sites on a particular provider. I won't mention the name.
Yeah.
But that's what they're known for, is like having lots of WordPress sites. And
Yep.
My sites are static. There's nothing happening with it. It's super boring.
Yep.
And I don't understand how this sort of shared hosting, that people can put these WordPress like files all over my directory area.
It's crazy.
And I'm like, how is that even possible? Like, isn't that password protected and so forth? So something weird's going on there. And I was talking to like a more like cloud hosts that, where you truly are like setting up your own instance and it's no longer a shared thing, which is probably where I need to go. But it was just like, I've used this company forever, but it's insane. Like, and they just like drop like all these like commonly named,
they just dump all of the stuff,
basically malicious files. Yeah. And they're not going to get anything because like they're not set up, from mine. But yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, looking at log files is really funny sometimes. You're like, man, you're trying this thing that's like 10 years old.
Okay.
And then the scary thing is,
do they work though sometimes?
That's the scary thing is like, then you're like, well, they wouldn't be trying it if it didn't actually like work sometimes.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's also really tough, like from a security standpoint, because every new vulnerability that comes out, like it's another thing to throw on the fire.
Yeah.
You're still having to worry about the vulnerability that came out 2 years ago, like if people aren't patching and stuff like that. So
is that where the automated tools can help you because they have that library of history?
Especially with like the containerization side of things, like a lot of folks are putting, their apps in containers.
Yeah.
Which is great because, you can have consistency. The problem is like if you aren't rebuilding those on a consistent manner,
right,
some of the software becomes really stale, and
you're literally, requirements have like pinned versions and things.
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
And so things like, I love GitHub's like Dependabot. I know it annoys people sometimes, but like the fact that they can keep things updated and do like simple pull requests is such an awesome thing. And then especially with like some of the automated pipelines and things like that for builds and deploys, I would say if we had these tools like 10, 15 years ago, it would have been so much nicer, from a security standpoint.
Yeah, I can imagine. You've mentioned all these kind of cool potential places that someone could look at working in this industry. And then I kind of wonder about like, if they're interested in that, like, do you have suggestions like where they could learn some more of these skills? Like, I know you kind of did the school of hard knocks of literally like getting in the trenches and learning, and then kind of getting invited into, kind of these circles to learn a little bit more. But I would guess there's still be a good place to maybe start now, certain resources that you would say, hey, these are good places to begin looking.
So There are so many awesome resources these days when it comes to security. And I think it's one of these things like, first, figure out what interests you. If you want to do like finding vulnerabilities or things like that, look and see what bug bounty programs there are.
Okay.
There's a bunch of vulnerable, like, software things where you can go through and basically do testing on like super vulnerable software and write your own, bugs. And it's basically almost like a capture the flag type of thing where you like continue. It's like a game.
Very gamified.
Yeah. And it's really fun though, because you're learning things. You're learning how to like exploit certain things or use them to like actually practically apply some of these security things.
Is that like a site or a service that you would pay for to check out?
A lot of these things are free.
Okay.
Like they'll have either Docker containers or VMs that you can just run on your laptop.
Okay.
And it's pretty cool. The other thing is there are so many. I would say if you look at any security related software project,
Yeah.
it's probably like a 50-50 chance whether it's been written in Python. It's either going to be Python, C, or Go. Like most of those.
Okay.
People love when people are interested in the projects. Like if somebody is wanting to get into security, the biggest thing that I could recommend anyone is just go talk to people.
Okay.
If there's a security conference, go talk to somebody. If you work at a company where you're a developer or, engineer, talk to your security people. Just show like that you're interested in what they have to say.
Yeah.
They're more than happy to open up. I just think, a lot of times folks, they're only dealing with what's going on at that particular moment. So people are sometimes busy, but if people are interested, we love to help folks.
That's cool. You had mentioned, and I will include a lot of these libraries that you shared with me.
Mm-hmm.
These will be pretty massive show notes, so please come check them out. James has put a lot of work into it, and I'm going to add as much as I can to it to help you get an idea of some of these things to kind of work with. What I was wondering about was, you mentioned all these packages and tools and kind of knowing some of these people that are creating them and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like I know it took a little bit to get into that community, but that's one of the things I really love about Python, and I've said it a ton of times, is just the community is generally positive and friendly and interested in people getting involved in it and sharing resources and so forth. And I wonder about that for like the package and tool creators in the same way. Like if somebody goes and looks at some of these projects and maybe they want to get involved in them, you feel like that they're open to that?
I feel like the people that are kind of, for lack of a better descriptor, like very, get off my lawn types of folks, they don't do open source releases.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
All right. Okay, sure.
And honestly, like
their lawn is not listed.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. All right.
And the thing is like, it's all about the approach. And, the other thing, face-to-face interactions at like security conferences.
Yeah.
If a developer came up to me and introduced themselves and said, "Hey, I, write Python code and like, these are some of the things that I'm interested in. Could you introduce me to folks? Like, I'm new to this community."
Yeah.
People are pretty open, on that.
That's cool.
Yeah. I mean, they might be a little standoffish first, but like once you have a beer or two, or just are hanging out and having a chat,
yeah,
they tend to open up, and that's where like sometimes the face to face is actually even better than doing the stuff online.
Are there conferences coming up that you can name?
Yeah, I mean like Black Hat, DEF CON are some of the biggest ones that you'll always hear about. But there's also CCC out in Europe is a great one. And there's also like tons of local, security conferences. So
are there like meetup groups? Like I think of that for Python.
There's tons of meetups. And honestly, like, if you go to one of those and you're like, I'm an engineer and I like security, are there any interesting projects?
I'm interested. Yeah.
You would probably have to, push people away, on stuff like that. So
you're in Phoenix. Like, are there ones locally in Arizona there?
Yeah, so there's actually kind of a little bit of a shout out, but there's a conference called CactusCon,
Okay.
and I don't remember when it is scheduled to go on. I want to say like November or December or something like that.
Okay. Sometime in the fall.
Yeah, like not during the burning months.
Yeah, it's not super fun to visit Arizona. We talked about that earlier. Yeah, unless you're up north.
Yeah, but there's also there's a thing called Security B-sides as well, and they've got a bunch of local ones, across the world. There's all over, some of these meetups and things like that, and we'll include some links as well.
One of the fun things that happened with some of the meetups over the last year or two has been them being virtual, and I wonder if that might be something where if you're located somewhere and there's not something happening physically around you, that you might be able to find like a remote one that you can kind of check out.
Yeah, there are some remote ones. I think the security community is weird in some ways. Like they're very like it's hard to get into, but once you're in, it's the most welcoming, place ever.
Okay, cool.
I love everyone there, but sometimes like it's that face-to-face connection that is important, for folks.
Yeah, you mentioned that earlier.
Yeah,
building that trust.
Yeah, and it's one of these things like, I think part of the problem is we see all the bad stuff that happens online. So it's really hard to trust anyone that isn't like directly in front of you. You know what I mean?
Yeah, okay. That makes sense.
We have trust issues.
Why?
Yeah, exactly. I wonder why that happens, right?
That's funny. Shields up.
Yep.
Okay. Hey, well, I have these weekly questions I like to ask everybody. And the first one is, what's something you're excited about in the world of Python right now?
First things first, like all the linters that are...
Okay.
I know this is kind of geeky.
Have a favorite?
I've been playing around with Black recently. It's pretty cool.
Okay.
Many, many years ago, I kind of started doing the linting stuff. And I think a lot of people, had the same types of experiences, but, it would just cause all sorts of problems with your merge histories and stuff like that.
Right. Okay. Lots of changes at once.
Yeah. or worse, like somebody was running something with slightly different settings, and then it would just be, ping-ponging back and forth. But,
okay.
I think like some of the tools on that side, and then also like me being a security geek, just all the stuff that is doing like automated static analysis and, things like that. There are so many cool things that are in that area that it's really interesting to watch. The lexing and parsing stuff is just really interesting to me.
Okay. So like, is it even move into the natural language kind of area, or is it
kind of more just like pattern recognition?
Okay. Yeah. I guess it would be different tools. Can you name a tool?
Yeah. There's a couple custom ones that haven't been like open source that I've played with.
Okay.
But they're all written in Python and, pretty cool. But I think there's a few, and I don't know if they've been released yet, but
okay.
Really, really cool stuff.
All right. Well, if we find one, we can toss it in there.
Yeah. There are some open source ones though.
Nice.
We'll toss it in the notes.
Okay. What do you want to learn next? And this doesn't have to be Python or programming specific.
I don't mean to sound like a really, old person that, walked up the hill both ways, but
okay.
So some of the newer async stuff in Python, like most of the things that I've done in Python have all been like very synchronous, like, it's serial, you must do this before this.
Yeah.
And I've always been the point where like when it needs to scale, then, we either break it out into different processes or just shard it across like massive compute nodes. Some of the async stuff, is really neat to me.
Yeah.
And, it's
save you some time.
Yeah, exactly. And also specifically like on the web side of things, there's lots of really cool stuff in there. So like, I want to get much more deep into that. And especially with some of the stuff that's recently come out with, like some of the language specific things for speed up on Python, I think they're leveraging a lot of that internally. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. I'm doing a story on that. The beta released the feature freeze. They've kind of given you an idea of like what things have been sped up in the language in different areas.
It's ridiculous.
It's going to be cool.
Some of those.
Yeah. I'm excited.
I guess the big thing is just like understanding how it, like on the low level side, the implementation details is more what I'm wanting to learn.
Yeah, cool. We have a recent tutorial that I liked a lot that just got turned into a video course. It was basically a site connectivity checker. And you kind of set it up initially just to kind of like, are these sites up, and you're using sort of standard tools. But at the end of it, you look at, if you want, you can, in the command line interface, just throw a flag that will make it run async. And it's pretty cool to measure the difference between the two and then look at how the code changes between the two. You get a real good view of something beyond just like the, common examples in a lot of tutorials trying to teach you async is just to throw like a delay.
Send a web request. Yeah.
Yeah, or something. Yeah. And so this one was kind of neat. And then you could do like a text file that would have like a list of all these different sites that you wanted to check. And it was cool because it would actually, have to bounce around depending on what it was waiting on and so forth. It was a neat example.
Very cool. Yeah.
So where can people find out more about what you do?
I'm a little private.
Okay.
I think if folks want to hit me up, you can email me. I'm jp@sheeple.us.
Okay.
And then I'm also Twitter, but I'm not very active. Just Pleger on that. So JPLEGER. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, James, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's been fantastic to talk to you.
It's been awesome. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we'll have you come back and we'll dive deeper into one of these subjects.
Awesome. Thank you.
I want to thank James Pleger for coming on the show this week. And I want to thank you for listening to the Real Python podcast. Make sure that you click that follow button in your podcast player. And if you see a subscribe button somewhere, remember that the Real Python podcast is free. If you like the show, please leave us a review. You can find show notes with links to all the topics we spoke about inside your podcast player or at realpython.com/podcast. And while you're there, you can leave us a question or a topic idea. I've been your host, Christopher Bailey, and I look forward to talking to you soon.